Arthur's treatment in the newspapers was different nationally and locally. I know I've already touched on this, but in the national newspapers, Arthur's physiology, his physical appearance, was virtually always commented upon. He was called a brunette of pronounced complexion, a West Indian gentleman, an African man of colour. There was always reference to his physical appearance, which then obviously instantly marked him out from the rest of the people he was competing against or playing with. Whereas locally, it wouldn't normally be referred to in the local newspapers when he lived in Darlington, when he lived in South Yorkshire, which was the bulk of his adult life. It was very rare for the newspapers to comment upon his colour. And so locally, because he was a national sporting celebrity, he kind of brought kudos to a community. You know, he's this big star living locally in his... You know, he lived in working class areas. He lived in Rawmarsh, Greesborough, he lived in Sheffield, he lived in Stalybridge, he lived in Ashton. These are working class kind of communities. And I think from what Arthur said in interviews and from the readings of the newspaper cuttings, he was treated with a great deal of respect and almost awe locally, whereas it was very different nationally. That's not to say that he didn't get racism. He did. It's reported that he you know, as I mentioned the incident at the athletics event where he was called a nigger. There's incidents reported in the newspapers of where he was attacked when he left after a game. He's battered with umbrellas after one game and ended up in hospital. But that we don't know the reasons why it's not. We don't know if that was a racist attack or it was just the fact they were playing away and they got caught by the home crowd, because there was a fair amount of violence, crowd violence, at Victorian football matches. It's nothing new. So the kind of racism Arthur would have faced would have been a bit different to the racism that footballers faced in the 60s, 70s and 80s of monkey chants throwing bananas on the foot. The kind of racism Arthur would have faced was that accepted kind of common sense notion that merely by being a man of colour and being African, you were inferior in a biological sense and in an evolutionary sense to a white person. So that, you know, that your place in the world, in the hierarchy of races, was low down compared to the white man, you know. So, however, because the black population of Britain was much less than it is today, he still had a kind of exotic appeal in that sense. There weren't, you know, as many black Africans living in Britain as there are today. There were black communities all around Britain, but mainly in the ports and the big cities, but not so large as they are today. So the response to black people was not that like they were seen in the 50s, 1950s and 1960s here by many communities as a threat to jobs, to housing. It was more of an exotic, they were unusual, they were different, you know. Often children used to ask black people if they had tails and this kind of thing because of this notion that they were less evolved species and nearer to the, you know, in a Darwinian sense, to the monkey, you know. So it's that kind of racism of a kind of pseudo-Darwinist, pseudo-scientific form, really. Arthur moved to South Yorkshire in around 1888, 1887, 88. The exact date is unclear. It would have been for sporting reasons. Arthur was known as a pedestrian, i.e. as a runner, and the professional championships were in Sheffield at the Queen's Ground. Lots of the big events, running events, were in the Yorkshire area. And it's probable that his trainer, George Wallace, would have suggested. He was trained by a man called George Wallace in around 1887, 88, and he was from Sheffield. We've not got it from Arthur. He doesn't say exactly why he moved, but it would probably almost certainly have been for sporting reasons. He signed for Rotherham Town in 1889 as a professional. That's his first formal professional contract, was with Rotherham Town. It would have been almost, you know, it would have been almost certain that he would have been given money to play for Preston North End, but it would have been seen as expenses. But my bet is that the expenses he was given at Preston North End in 1886, 1887 would have been as big as his wage packet at Rotherham Town. Simultaneously, in signing for Rotherham Town, he married a local girl from Rawmarsh called Emma Lister, whose father had a plumber/stroke hardware shop in Greesborough, and so Arthur settled in this in South Yorkshire. He played for Rotherham at football, Rotherham Town, and he played for Rawmarsh Cricket Club. He ran at the 1888 professional championships at the Queen's Ground, which he won. So between the years 1886 and say 1889, they were the kind of the peak really of his sporting triumphs, because he was 3A's champion for 2 years, professional champion for a year, signed a professional football contract. So it was a kind of golden time for Arthur. When Arthur was buried, he was put in an unmarked grave, and his wife, Emma Lister, lived for some years, I can't remember exactly how many, but a number of years after Arthur died. When she died, she wasn't buried in the same grave as Arthur. Now, the reasons why that happened weren't known at the time, but subsequently, with the help of Sheila Leeson, who's Arthur's granddaughter, we can piece together some of the facts about Arthur's personal life through the politics of the family, like who wasn't talking to who was talking to who. Now it seems that when Arthur married Emma, we know they didn't have any children, but it's almost certain that Arthur had 2 children with Emma's sister Martha, who'd already had a child with somebody else. Now, Martha was a bit of a girl, and Arthur was a bit of a lad in that respect, because they both had children out of marriage. And the reason, I mean, you know, that you could put forward any number of reasons. It was a moral reason. Morally, you can say it was wrong. He cheated on his wife. You could say maybe in a just in a reproductive sense, Emma may not have been able to have children, and in the Gold Coast, to be fatherless would have carried far more of a kind of negative cultural value to it than being fatherless in Britain. So perhaps there was that inner feeling with Arthur that he wanted children but couldn't have them with Emma. Perhaps he fell in love with Martha and it was a barren marriage with Emma. We don't know. There's all sorts of reasons you can put forward, but it's almost certain that 2 daughters, Nora and Minnie, that were born to Martha are Arthur's children, because on the birth certificate of one, they're given the name Wharton, and on the birth certificate of the other, they're not given any father's name, but both were swarthy skinned, as the expression was then. They were kind of olive skinned, brown eyes, and they had features that could have been attributed to Arthur. And Sheila Leeson, who at first thought she was related to Arthur through marriage, but subsequently feels that she's his granddaughter, and that her mother was Arthur's daughter. You can see actually the features in her grandchildren. You know, that one of her grandchildren